Okay, so question 2. In what order do the events happen? Cyclical or sequential? So what I've, in last week's sessions, shared with you is a sequential storyline that looked like this. First come the 7 seals, then the 7 trumpets, and then the 7 bowls. But actually, some people don't interpret it that way. Many people interpret it this way, which is that when he describes the 7 trumpets, it's actually describing, trumpet number 1 is the same thing as seal number 1. And then when he gets to the bowls, it's the same thing. Bowl number 1 is the same as trumpet number 1. They're just different perspectives on the same set of events. Okay, so some people really interpret it that way, and then of course those who view it sequentially. Now, I would like to give you the opportunity to examine what you think. So if you take a look at what I've done here, I've described the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls next to each other. So, row number 1 is number 1, number 1, number 1. And I've put that next to the 10 plagues of Exodus so that you can look at any correlation there. And I've put that next to the 7 days of creation so that you can look at any correlation there. Now, if you just compare these, just pick one, pick a row, and look at whether or not it seems to be that, row number 4, all 3 things are describing the same thing. What are your views?
There's a line. If I take number 7, hail, earthquake, antichrist, then earthquake again. Is there a line? Is there a line that runs through, or not?
So fortunately, I've done the hard work for you. so there are times where there's some kind of correlation, right? There are those times, and so hail, does kind of, something falling from the sky does run across number 7. But if you look across them in general, there's not really a pattern like that where they look the same. And in fact, if you really just trying to understand what the passage itself says, they're totally different. Even when there's similarity, like let's take the rivers. In number 3, the trumpet, a third of the river's waters go bitter. In number 3, the bowls, all fresh water on the face of the earth becomes blood. Now, I just want to think about living in those times. What is the difference between you having to struggle much more to get hold of water because 1/3 of the water on the earth, it's not drinkable. And so it's more scarce and it's more difficult to get hold of water. What's the difference between that and there is no fresh water on the face of the planet ever again? Could those 2 things be more infinitely different to you as a human being living on the planet? So the point I'm making is they're mathematically fundamentally different. Even if they're thematically similar, similar things happen to similar things, they're quantitatively so different they can't be the same thing. You can't say, I'm going to judge you and take away 1/3 of drinking water, and I'm going to judge you and take away all drinking water, and then say those are the same thing. You cannot do that. So even when there are similarities, they're actually quantitatively very different. They're also qualitatively different. Over here, 1/3 of the rivers is turned bitter, which would have been contamination or something which poisons the water. That's how they would have understood that. Here, all drinking water turns to blood. So they're qualitatively very different outcomes. Similarly, the sun over here, 1/3 of the sun is removed. It's like 1/3 of the sun's energy somehow is no longer available. Here, there's so much energy coming from the sun, it scorches human beings. So it's an opposite effect. So on superficial examination, one might see similarity. On closer examination, total difference. Therefore, for me, it's really difficult to see these as being recapitulations. That's the term that they use, that it's cyclical, that actually number one, they're all the same thing, seal, trumpet, bowl.
I think it's just more, also if you look at it figuratively as an example of something that might happen, then you can provoke it.
Exactly, great point. So if you take a very allegorical interpretation, then yes. But if you take a very allegorical interpretation, this could refer to Julius Malema becoming president. I mean, that's how I read it. So
it becomes meaningless.
Becomes meaningless because it can mean whatever you want it to mean.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the first question about the order in which they happen, and in my view, the conclusion is clear. They're sequential. There are 21 separate events. But then the next question is, okay, what happens between these things? Because actually, you don't only have scriptures describing seals, bowls, and trumpets. For example, you've got, in chapter 6, you've got seal number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then later on, you've got the 7th seal being opened. And then after that's opened, you've got trumpet number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But in between, you have these pesty passages which don't fit the pattern, right? They're different. They're not describing a seal or a trumpet or a bowl. And this would be chapter 7 in summary terms. So what do you do with those passages? If you view the events as sequential, what do you do with the things that happen between the events? And there's a really simple answer to this, in my view, which is explained by how you normally tell a story. You don't normally tell a story where every single thing you describe happens one after the other. If I tell the story about how Kath and Johan met and got married, I might start by describing who Kath is and what she was looking for. And then after that, I might go and talk about Johan and who he is and what he is looking for. And I'm not talking about those happening sequentially. They actually happen in parallel. The descriptions of those two human beings at the same point in time. But because you're a human and I'm a human, I can only talk about them one after the other. So I'm talking about parallel things, but I'm talking about them, sequentially in terms of the order in which the words appear on the page. And so I won't go through this, but here's an example of how a normal story is told, where you have an event, and then, oh, by the way, this event gets unpacked in a lot more detail. And then you come back to this event, and then you go to the next event. And the same thing happens at the next level, event, oh, this one gets unpacked in a bit more detail. And the detail is normally important information needed to understand the event, which is being described in more detail. And that extra information could be something about the future, the past, or the present. Are you following me? So when I describe Kath's, the novel of Kath's life, your biography, one day, I might get to a point in your marriage where I'm describing your marriage, and I might actually then reference something that happens 20 years in the future, because in the story, it gives meaning to that particular part of your life, what your dreams and ambitions were. So I might talk about something in the future, even though sequentially, I'm talking about you when you're 31 years old. So that's how stories work, and that is also how the book of Revelation works.
Yeah.
There are things that happen, and this will look intimidating. Just, what I want you to take in is simply the scheme of things, that it's a pyramid, like any other story, and actually there are only 4 main points in the story. And then all the rest is detail behind one of those points. And as you go through the story, the main storyline is the dark blue, but there are other types of narrative in the story. And when you turn that into a storyline, which is a much simpler way of looking at it, you have a black line, which is a chronological set of events that happen one after the other in that order. And in parallel to that, you have these gray lines, which are things that just happen in parallel to the black line. So chapter 8 and 9 are over here, and then chapter 10 describes stuff that happens at the same time as chapter 8 and 9. And chapter 11 also describes stuff that happens at the same time as chapter 8 and 9, and that's why these lines are in parallel. Now this is important to know, because if you don't know this, and you read it all as happening one after the other, you won't get an accurate view of the storyline. And so the question you have to ask is, how do you know what is the main storyline and what are the subplots? What are the things that happen in parallel? And the answer is pretty simple. The book gives us punctuation marks. And the punctuation marks are the seals and the trumpets and the bowls. When it describes seals and trumpets and bowls, it's describing events that happen one after the other.
So,
the lights went out. That might happen in here too. I don't know. And when it then between seal number 6 and seal number 7 seems to change topic entirely, and then later it comes back and it says seal number 7, then you know the stuff it was talking about that seemed to change topic entirely is a subplot. It's an expansion on one of the seals, or it's a subplot of something that happened in parallel. Are you following me? This is too conceptual and vague.
Because you know it's a very Hebrew style of writing. Moses says, and God created man in his own image, the image of God created him, chapter 1.
Chapter 1, yes.
Really goes into great detail and
Expansion, exactly right.
It's a Hebrew style of writing.
Exactly, it is. And in many of the prophecies, that's what they do. They start like Zechariah, chapter 12, and the Israelites, the people, all nations will go to war against them, and then they'll be saved when they recognize the Messiah. And then there are another 3 chapters describing that 6 verses in an expanded detail. Yeah. So it's a very Hebrew style of writing. It's unpacking. So he says, in modern terms, if you're presented, they'll say, tell them what you're about to tell them, then tell them what you just told them, right? That's kind of a style of presenting to people so that they can absorb and understand the message. You summarize it, then you give the full story, and then you summarize again. And that's typically what Hebrews do as well. So this then becomes your view of what's the main storyline, the black line, and what are the subplots, the grey lines. I know this particular section has been quite abstract, and I didn't know how to do it in a more concrete way, in a little time, but what you will do now is you will now use this as you read through the book as a guide to what's the main storyline and what is the subplot. Okay, you had a question? I have, okay. Was your question, what the hell good is this? Okay. Cool, guys. So that is then the order of events. It's 21 things, one after the other, with a couple of subplots in between. And so the last question is the timeline. How do we now understand how these events map to a timeline? And the reason you've got to answer that is because there are many different views, and here I've just given you 5 common views of how these different events map to a timeline. And if I just orient you, these red lines are 3.5-year markers. Between the outer red lines is 7 years, and in the middle, is a 3.5-year breakpoint. And most end-time scholars view the end times as having a 7-year period toward the end. Many reasons we'll cover during the course. But what you'll notice is that some scholars, this is Mike Bickle, view all 21 events happening in the last 3.5 years. It all kicks off at the midpoint. Others view it as all happening in the midpoint, and there's no 30-day period after, the 7 years is up. Whereas Mike Bickle views there being a 50-day period after the last 3.5 years. And then there are those who believe that, the seals are before the 7 years starts, and the rest all happens through the 7.5 years. So how are you to now know, which one is accurate, which one is true? Well, I'll give you my view of the single most important factor which indicates which of these interpretations is true. And we'll cover this in detail when we get to chapter 12 and 13, but for now, I'll give you a preview. If you look at chapter particularly 8 and 9, it's when the trumpets get blown. And with each trumpet, there's a judgment on the face of the earth. What you'll notice is a pattern. First angel blows his trumpet, stuff happens on the earth. Second angel blows trumpet, stuff happens on the earth. Same for the third, same for the fourth. Then there's this funny passage. And the funny passage says that there was an eagle flying overhead, and he cried with a loud voice, woe, 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 at the sound of the next 3 trumpets. Okay, so it sounds like what he's saying is each of the next 3 trumpets is going to be a woe. That's what it sounds like. And it turns out that's true, because then the 5th angel blows his trumpet, stuff happens, and after it describes what happens, then there's this funny little verse, and it says, the first woe has passed, the 2 woes are still to come. Seems incredibly unambiguous. He's trying to say the 5th trumpet is the first woe. The same thing happens with the 6th angel. 6th angel blows his trumpet, and at the end of describing all the stuff that happens, again he says, the 2nd woe has passed. The 3rd woe is still to come. So what you can tell is, in a book that is extremely economical with words, the Bible, they didn't have a lot of space to write on. He uses a lot of words to make sure we know the first woe is the 5th trumpet. The 2nd woe is the 6th trumpet. Do you see that? So what do you expect to happen next?
The next trumpet and the next woe.
the next trumpet, stuff described, the next woe. Only that doesn't happen in quite that way. But when you search through the book of Revelation for the word woe, what you notice is it appears 6 times. Once in the verse that says woe, woe, woe at the sound of the next trumpet. Once at the 5th trumpet, once at the 6th trumpet, and then one more time. It only appears one more time. Logic would suggest this one more time is describing the 3rd woe. Logic would suggest, therefore, that this is what we should look at to understand what the 3rd woe is. And in fact, it happens in, the very same sequence of events. And as you unpack that 3rd woe, this is where the word woe comes. At the end of chapter 12, we are told the devil's been thrown down to the earth with his angels. And then it says, woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you.
That's the final woe.
That's the final woe. It seems pretty clear.
Yeah.
And that is the Great Tribulation. And as you see the further explanation, it says, woe to you, for the devil has come down. It then describes what the devil does when he comes down. And what does he do? The dragon stood on the sand of the sea, and then I saw a beast arise out of the sea, and another beast arise out of the earth, and the beast exercised authority for 42 months. So the 3rd woe is the Great Tribulation. The 3rd woe is the 42-month period for which the devil rules on the earth through the Antichrist. Therefore, the 3rd woe is 42 months long. Therefore, the 7th trumpet is 42 months long. Are you following me? Therefore, the first 6 trumpets cannot have happened in the last 3.5 years. They must have happened before that. And in fact, there are quite a lot of other timing indicators. Kath, I'll come to your question in a moment. I recommend you read through this page, but it's remarkable, actually, that if you understand the timeline this way, there are these divine markers that there's a theophany, an appearance of God in his temple, as well as an earthquake, as well as hail, falling at the beginning of the 7 years, and at the middle, and at the end. That only happens if you understand the scripture in this way, the timeline in this way. It seems to me, look, it's circumstantial evidence, but it's quite compelling to me. So anyway, we won't go into this slide in detail. This just summarizes the argument I just laid out for you, that the 3rd woe is 42 months. And what that means is if you look at all these timelines where all of these have most of the trumpets and some of them also most of the seals happening in the last 3.5 years, they can't be true. Because the last 42 months is the 3rd woe, which is the 7th trumpet. Okay, did everyone follow that, or do you have questions, comments? Does that sound like what the book itself is trying to say in a very clear way? I mean, the book goes to a lot of effort to give us what I call punctuation marks, right? The seals and the trumpets and the bowls, they punctuate, which means they put brackets around or, specific sequence of events that are meant to understand as one set, one cluster of events, right? So between the 4th seal and the 5th seal being opened, there's a set of events we're meant to understand as one set of events that happens in one window related to the 4th seal. Those are punctuation marks. And the book goes to a lot of effort to give us those punctuation marks. And if those punctuation marks are there so prominently, we should, give them the place they deserve. And I believe that this is the only timeline which does that. By the way, if you don't do what we just said, i.e. make the 3rd woe equal to the Antichrist's reign, which is equal to the 42-month Great Tribulation, which therefore makes the 7th trumpet, the 42-month Great Tribulation. If you don't do that, you effectively have to believe that the 3rd woe is not mentioned, firstly. So, and this is what commentators who believe this actually say. The 3rd woe is not mentioned as a woe, notwithstanding that the word woe does appear to describe a set of events right after the 2nd woe. In addition, you have to believe that the 7 bowls is effectively the 3rd woe, which completely changes it's discontinuous with the pattern of the 1st woe and the 2nd woe. The 1st and 2nd woe are very clear. One trumpet, one woe. One trumpet, one woe. One trumpet, one woe. But now you have to say one trumpet, one woe, one trumpet, one woe, one trumpet, nothing, no event, no, and then 7 bowls, 1 woe. Do you see that the pattern does not hold up? Okay, now some do say, well, look, the 7th trumpet is all 7 bowls together, but still it doesn't correlate as well with what the passage itself seems to be trying to do, saying this is the woe, here it is, it's the devil who's come down to you, O earth. Okay, so that's the reason why I believe this is the correct timeline, particularly that the 7th trumpet equals the Great Tribulation. Therefore, by conclusion, the other 6 trumpets happen before that, right? They must happen before that, and by inference in the first half of the 7 years. And the part which I'm open to a different view on completely is that the 7 seals happen before the 7-year period. That could happen during, the first 3.5 years, could happen before. I believe there's a very strong reason why I believe the first trumpet starts the 7-year period, but we won't go into that now. We'll go into that when we get to chapter 8. Okay, so that's the third question. What is the timeline? The way that you can memorize this on Friday nights when you have nothing else to do is by looking at this poster, this 2 A3 versions, having mapped out the timeline across the top over here. This is the timeline, and this is a summary of each chapter in its literary structure, and then in this main body of the poster are the pictures summarizing the passages of the text, the visions given within that framework, and they're sorted into the 5 major themes of the judgments, the church, Israel, the nations, and Babylon, the false religion. So this can be your number 1 poster to summarize and, remember the structure and the overall scheme of the book. And that's it. That's the next kind of 2 S's. It brings us to the end of this session, and I think of this night. I had actually planned, by the way, to get through the next 3 S's tonight, but we won't. So let me just park it there and open to questions and comments and discussion, and then we'll close for the evening.
In terms of, like I said, they're 42 months.
Yeah.
Are 42 months.
So my belief is yes. My belief is that it's mentioned so many times in so many different ways that it's meant to be described as literal. It's described as 42 months. Separately, it's described as 3.5 years. Separately, it's described as 1,260 days. So that's, it seems to be leaning in the direction that this is a, literal time frame. But in addition to that, this last 7 years, people understand there to be a future 7-year time of great tribulation from, firstly, Daniel chapter 9, which describes the 70 times 7 years for Israel, where 483 of the years have come, and there remains another 7 years. So people, scholars understand there to be a literal 7-year period, which will be the Great Tribulation. And in that very passage, Daniel 9:27, that 7 years is divided into 2 halves. 42 months, 42 months. It's only 1 verse, but there's a biblical precedent, a strong, clear precedent for there being a 7-year period to come in future history, which will ultimately lead to the salvation of Israel and the ushering in of righteousness on the face of the earth, i.e. the end of this age. And that is broken into 2 3.5-year periods. So it seems like we should interpret it as a literal 1,260 physical days of our time times 2. That looked like a yawn pregnant with a question behind a riddle. Okay.
You're saying those first 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, which is the first 3.5 years, that correlates to Jesus' wars and rumors of wars, etc., etc.
Well, actually, my interpretation, which I don't hold strongly, is that the wars, rumors of wars, etc., correlates to the first 4 seals, which in my view happened before the 7 years start. That the 7 seals lead up to the start of the the 7-year period, and when the seventh seal is opened, that commences the 7-year tribulation. That's my interpretation. And the main reason for that, I'll just give you a preview, but we'll cover this in detail, is that when the seventh seal is opened, that's when the 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from every tribe, have been saved. That process comes to an end when the seventh seal is opened. That's the first time through history since AD 33 that national Israel can be viewed as God's people. The ethnic national group of Jews can be viewed as God's people because they're 12,000 from all 12 tribes who worship God. Unlike in history where it's a couple but it's mostly Gentiles. It seems to me that 12 times 12,000 saved at that time, it represents something very special about the recommencement of Israel's history in their relationship with God as a nation, not just as scattered individuals who are Messianic Jews. So I'm very open to different views on that because I think it's a cryptic interpretation, and there's only, you can only take that so far. But that's my interpretation, that then commences the clock of the 490 years again. For those of you for whom that was a mystery, what I just said, we'll cover that in detail in a future session.